March 1945, Germany. A commander of a Panzer formation, General Major Klaus Reinhold, had been trapped for 2 days in an encirclement outside a small settlement to the east of the Rhine. His armored vehicles had run dry of fuel, his infantry elements were dispersed, and members of his own headquarters staff were already quietly exploring surrender terms without his involvement. Reinhold rejected any participation in those discussions. He withdrew alone to the upper level of a farmhouse that faced the road, holding a pistol, and transmitted a message through a seized radio set stating that he would rather die in place than submit to capture by any opposing force, including any American officer who believed he could simply arrive and conclude the situation. That communication reached General George Patton at his forward headquarters less than 1 hour after being sent. Patton had encountered similar last stands before. This one differed only in the direct way Reinhold had framed his challenge, explicitly naming Patton as though the confrontation had been directed at him personally from the outset. Patton departed for the farmhouse without delay. He stepped out of his jeep alone and approached the building, stopping at the base of the staircase. From there, he called upward to the second level, stating his identity, rank, and presence. Reinhold answered immediately from above, speaking in fluent English. He warned that if Patton advanced even one more step, he would be shot where he stood. Patton remained still for a moment, looking into the empty stairwell above. Then he placed his foot onto the first step and began to climb. Before the account continues, it is worth noting Reinhold's background. He had led the 22nd Panzer Division since the previous autumn, taking command after his predecessor was killed during the withdrawal across France that followed the Allied breakout from Normandy. At that time, he was 46 years old, a professional officer with prior service in Poland during the initial invasion phase. He had also served in France during the 1940 campaign and later during the retreat, and spent nearly 2 years on the Eastern Front before being reassigned westward in the war's final months. As Germany attempted to consolidate its remaining armored strength in a desperate effort to slow the Allied push toward the Rhine, his unit was reduced to a small fraction of its original combat capability by the time it reached the position outside the town in March 1945. Fuel shortages had already immobilized most of his remaining tanks days earlier. Crews were forced to abandon vehicles that could no longer move and continue on foot, carrying only the weapons and ammunition they could physically manage. By the time American forces completed the encirclement, Reinhold had roughly 200 soldiers under his command. He had no functioning armor left, no air support available, and no viable route to break out of the surrounding forces. Within his own staff, quiet discussions about surrender had begun the previous evening. According to later statements from several officers, this had been done without Reinhold's knowledge or approval. They had identified nearby American units through radio contact established earlier and were preparing to initiate surrender procedures when Reinhold learned of it by chance. He immediately shut down the process. Taking his personal sidearm, he removed himself to the upper floor of the farmhouse and declared loudly that he would not surrender under any circumstances, regardless of what the rest of his staff chose to do. The message that directly named Patton had been transmitted through the same captured radio equipment his staff had used to reach American forces the night before. It was intercepted and passed up through command channels until it reached Patton's forward headquarters in less than 1 hour. According to Patton's aide present at the time, Patton read the message twice without speaking. He then asked who Reinhold was, requested details of his service record, and ordered a map showing the exact position of the farmhouse before addressing anyone further. When Patton reached the farmhouse about 40 minutes later, the scene outside matched what had been reported earlier. The remaining men from Reinhold's unit were still present, though some had already begun drifting away in ones and twos after learning their commander had isolated himself inside the building. Those who stayed kept their distance, uncertain of their next move, while the structure stood sealed off as the center of the standoff. Patton's small escort arrived with him in 2 jeeps. They remained outside under direct instruction. Before approaching the entrance, he made it unmistakably clear that none of them were to enter after him. He also ordered that the building was not to be engaged unless a gunshot came from inside first. He repeated this instruction once more, then moved toward the house alone. Inside, he crossed the front room and found the base of the stairs leading upward. He called out toward the upper level in a steady voice, stating his name and rank with precision so there could be no misunderstanding about who had entered the building. Reinhold responded instantly from above. His reply came in English, clear and controlled, warning that if Patton took another step upward, he would be fired upon immediately. Patton held his position for a brief moment, looking up the staircase without moving. The quiet stretched long enough that those outside later said they expected a shot at any second. Then he placed his foot on the first step and started upward without hesitation. As he climbed, he spoke in an even tone that carried up the stairwell ahead of him. He told Reinhold that he'd clearly heard the warning and fully understood the intent behind it. He acknowledged that Reinhold was likely capable of acting on it without delay. Even so, he continued ascending because he wanted to see for himself the kind of man who intended to die alone in an abandoned farmhouse over a conflict that, by any professional military assessment, was already decisively lost. No gunfire occurred during the ascent. Patton reached the upper level and entered a mostly empty room where Reinhold stood alone at the far side. Reinhold's pistol was raised and aimed directly at him. His hand was steady, and his finger rested near the trigger. Patton stopped at the threshold. He did not reach for his own weapon. Instead, he addressed Reinhold with a single direct question. What purpose would be served by dying in that room that could not be achieved by surrendering instead? Reinhold answered that it would at least ensure he personally never surrendered. He added that whatever his staff chose to do would reflect only on them and not on him. He said he wanted to be remembered as an officer who held his position to the end, rather than one who yielded command without resistance. Patton then asked who, in practical terms, would actually care about that distinction, given that negotiations for surrender by his staff were already in motion before his arrival, and would determine the fate of every soldier under his command, regardless of what occurred in that room. Reinhold did not respond immediately to that question. After several long seconds of silence, with the pistol still held in place, Patton did not wait for a reply that was not coming. He kept speaking into the stillness instead. He stated that Reinhold's death in that farmhouse would not alter the final direction of the war. It would not prevent a single man under his command from facing capture. It would only leave about 200 soldiers without their commanding officer at the precise moment when leadership was most needed to guide them through surrender with structure and order instead of confusion and breakdown. Especially since staff-level negotiations were already continuing downstairs without him. The pistol stayed aimed toward the doorway for a few more moments after Patton finished. Then Reinhold's arm began to descend. The movement was slow at first, barely noticeable, until the weapon was no longer pointed at Patton and instead angled toward the floor. He spoke more quietly than before. His earlier certainty was gone. He said he had not fully resolved his decision at the exact moment Patton reached the top of the stairs. He confirmed that the threat had been real and meant sincerely when he issued it, but admitted that watching Patton continue upward without hesitation had altered something in his judgment that he could not clearly define even to himself. Patton then stepped fully into the room. He closed the distance and took the pistol from Reinhold's now open hand. There was no resistance. He told him directly that surrender at this point did not take away anything meaningful that had not already been lost during the 2 days of encirclement and gradual collapse. Reinhold was taken into custody without any further incident. Within the next hour, the remaining roughly 200 men of his unit surrendered as well. The process was carried out in an orderly way by staff officers who had already been preparing the arrangements before the confrontation in the farmhouse had interrupted them the night before. Patton's aide, who had stayed outside under orders during the entire exchange, later recorded that he counted every second of silence while Patton was inside the building. Each moment felt closer to a gunshot that never came. He also noted that the time inside, estimated at around 8 or 9 minutes in total, felt far longer in real time than it did afterward when the outcome was already known. Reinhold was processed as a standard prisoner of war. His rank and service record were documented but did not result in any exceptional treatment beyond what was normally given to senior captured officers. He was later questioned by Allied intelligence officers about broader German positions in the area. In the official transcript, there was almost no mention of the farmhouse incident except for one direct question about his reasoning that morning, which he answered briefly before the focus shifted to operational matters. He remained a prisoner until 1947, when he was released and returned to Bavaria. There, he lived in a small town and reportedly avoided public discussion of the farmhouse incident, turning away repeated requests from journalists and historians. Much later, a historian who obtained a short written statement from him said Reinhold reflected that the instant Patton placed his foot on the first step was the moment he realized something fundamental about himself. He had feared being remembered as a man who surrendered more than he had feared death itself, and only recognized that distinction clearly at that exact point in time. Is this conversation helpful so far? Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.